The river was the color of old pewter when Nora Vass first saw it, and something in her chest went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet, not the stillness that comes with rest or relief, the other kind, the kind her father used to call listening quiet, the silence a body makes when it is trying to hear something it doesn't want to hear. She stood at the edge of the Whitmore River Road with her canvas bag at her feet and her coat buttoned to the throat, and she looked at the water moving below the embankment, and she made herself look away. She had enough trouble already without borrowing any from the river. The town of Harlan, Oregon was not much of a town. It had a feed store, a post office that shared its building with a barber shop, a saloon that smelled of pine resin and unwashed ambition, and a cookhouse that served breakfast and supper for 30 cents a plate. Nora had eaten supper there the night before. Salt pork and boiled potatoes and a heel of bread that was better than it looked, and when she paid the woman behind the counter, she had turned her coin purse upside down and watched 2 pennies roll out onto the plank counter and known, with the flat clarity of a woman accustomed to hard facts, that she was done. Done with money, anyway. She had slept in the cookhouse woman's barn on the woman's charity, which was offered without warmth but without cruelty either, and in the morning she had eaten nothing and walked to the saloon because the saloon was where men went when they needed work or needed to give it, and Harlan's men were mostly loggers. The saloon was called the Stump, which Nora thought was either honest or unimaginative, possibly both. She pushed through the door at 7 in the morning and stood inside it for a moment while her eyes adjusted to the low light and the smell of the place settled over her. Sawdust and spilled beer and the particular sharpness of men who worked hard and bathed occasionally. 3 men sat at a table near the window. 2 more stood at the bar. The barman looked at her the way men in that kind of establishment always looked at women who came in alone at 7 in the morning, with a calculation she had long since stopped finding offensive. "I'm looking for work," she said. She did not say it loudly or apologetically. She said it the way she said most things, which was once and clearly so that she would not have to say it again. The barman set down the glass he was polishing. "What kind of work?" "Cooking. Camp cooking. I've done it before." One of the men at the table, heavy-set with a beard going gray at the jaw, turned in his chair to look at her. He had the hands of a man who had spent 30 years in timber, broad and scarred and missing the tip of the left index finger. His name, she would learn, was Clyde Oughton, and he was the supply foreman for the Whitmore River Camp, and he had been in Harlan for 3 days trying to solve a problem. "You cooked for a camp before?" he said. "2 seasons," she said. "Cascade outfit out of Bend. Before that I cooked for a ranch crew in Harney County." "How many men?" "The camp ran 42 at peak. The ranch was 14. Oughton studied her. He had the look of a man weighing something he didn't particularly want to carry. "Whitmore camp's running 31 men right now. It's a river camp. You know what that means?" "Wet," she said. He almost smiled. "Among other things. It's 6 miles upriver from here. Road's rough when it's dry, and near impassable when it's not. Supply wagon comes once a week, weather permitting. The foreman's name is Garrett Hollis, and he is not an easy man." He paused. "I've had 2 cooks quit on him in the last month." "Why?" "One didn't care for the conditions. The other didn't care for Hollis." He paused again. "I've asked around Harlan, asked around Denton before that. Nobody wants the position." Nora looked at him steadily. "What does it pay?" $1.50 a day, plus board." It was fair money. It was more than fair money for a camp cook. which told her something about either the conditions or the foreman or both. She thought about the 2 pennies on the cookhouse counter. She thought about the barn and the woman's charity, and the fact that charity, in her experience, had a shelf life. "When do you leave?" she said. They left at 9 o'clock in Otten's supply wagon, which was loaded with 100 pounds of flour, 50 pounds of cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, canned goods, and a crate of tools that shifted and clattered on every rut in the road. Nora sat on the wagon bench beside Otten and watched the country change as they moved upriver, the scrub and dust of the valley floor giving way to stands of Douglas fir that grew taller and closer together until the road was little more than a gap in the trees, and the sky overhead was a narrow seam of November gray. Otten was not a talkative man, which suited her. He told her the necessary things. The camp had been operating since August, cutting timber off a Whitmore River drainage lease. They were behind schedule. The autumn had been wetter than expected, and 2 weeks of rain in October had slowed the skid roads to mud. Hollis was pushing the men hard to make up time before the real winter came in. The cookhouse was a wall tent with a sheet iron stove, and the stove had a temperamental flue. The men ate at 5 in the morning, and noon, and 6 in the evening, and they were not particular about what they ate, as long as there was enough of it. "What happened to the last cook?" Nora said. "The one who didn't care for Hollis." Otten was quiet for a moment. "She said he didn't listen." Nora thought about that. To her specifically, or to anyone? "Anyone," he said. "But her specifically, too." She nodded and looked at the road. They crossed a plank bridge over a tributary creek, and Nora looked down at the water passing under it. Dark water, moving fast, carrying a faint reddish tint that she recognized as glacial sediment coming off the higher ground. The creek was running high for November, not dangerously high, not yet, but high in the way that suggested something upstream was contributing to it. Snowmelt, or a series of hard rains, or both. She watched the water until the bridge was behind them. Her father would have said something about it. He would have said it quietly, almost to himself, the way he said most things about weather and water. Not as a warning, exactly, but as a notation, the way a careful man marks a page. "Water's talkin'," he used to say. "Question is whether you're listening." She said nothing. It was not her river, yet. The camp appeared around a bend in the road without much announcement, a cluster of canvas wall tents and 2 rough-cut board structures set on a flat bench of ground above the river, the whole arrangement looking temporary in the way that logging camps always looked temporary, as though the men who built it had one eye on the work and the other on the exit. A skid road ran down from the tree line to the north, churned to deep mud by the passage of logs and horses. Smoke came from 2 of the tents, the sound of axes and the distant crash of timber carried through the trees from somewhere up the slope. The cookhouse tent was at the near end of the camp, and it was larger than Nora had expected, a 16 by 30 canvas wall tent with board flooring and a sheet iron stove at one end that was, as Otten had promised, connected to a flue pipe that disappeared through the canvas roof at an angle that suggested the man who installed it had been optimistic about physics. 2 long plank tables with benches ran the length of the tent. The cooking area was a chaos of mismatched equipment. A cast-iron skillet the size of a wagon wheel, a collection of tin pots in various states of denting, a Dutch oven, a meat saw, a breadboard warped by moisture. A sack of flour had been left open and was going stiff at the edges. Nora stood in the middle of it for a moment. Then she set down her bag, rolled up her sleeves, and closed the flour sack. "You'll want to meet Hollis," Otten said from the tent entrance. "After I've seen what I'm working with," she said. She worked through the inventory methodically. What was there, what was missing, what was salvageable. The stove she lit and watched for 10 minutes to understand the flue's particular character, and it was bad, but not hopeless. The breadboard she flipped over, the underside was flat. The cast iron skillet was well seasoned under a layer of old grease. Whoever had cooked here before had known what they were doing, at least with equipment. She was examining a side of salt pork when she heard boots on the board floor behind her and turned. Garrett Hollis was a tall man, lean in the way that men get lean when they spend all their energy on work and none of it on ease. He was perhaps 45, with a narrow face and pale eyes that moved over her with the brisk efficiency of a man taking inventory. He wore his authority the way some men wore their hats, like he'd had it so long he'd stopped noticing it was there. "You're the cook," he said. It was not a question. "Nora Vass," she said. "Otten says you've done camp work before." "That's right." He looked at the tent around him with the expression of a man who considered the cookhouse a logistical problem rather than a place where human beings ate food. "I need breakfast on the table at 5 sharp. Men work hard, they eat hard. I don't want complaints about the food, and I don't want the food to be a reason men are slow in the morning. You understand me?" "I understand you," she said. Something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. She met his eyes without any particular challenge in hers, just the level attention of a woman who had decided to be accurate rather than agreeable. "Good," he said. He turned to go, then stopped. "Otten says you came out of Harlan. You see the river on the way up?" "I did." "Running a little high. Nothing to worry about. We had rain last week." "It'll settle." Nora looked at him. She thought about the pewter color of the water, the reddish tint in the tributary creek, the way the current had been moving against the bridge pilings, not the lazy press of normal flow, but something with intention behind it. She thought about the sky she had watched all morning, the particular quality of the cloud cover, low and uniform and yellowish at the edges in a way she associated with sustained precipitation rather than passing weather. She thought about all of this in the space of 2 seconds, and she said, "All right." Because he was already turning away. Because she had been here less than an hour. Because she had 2 pennies to her name and a barn behind her and nothing ahead of her but this wage and this work and the cold fact of November in the Oregon mountains. She turned back to the salt pork. But the quiet was still in her chest. The listening quiet. The one that was not the good kind. And when she heard the river moving outside the canvas wall of the tent, low and constant and growing, she found that she could not quite make herself stop hearing it. She cooked supper that night from what was on hand, salt pork and beans and cornbread and a pot of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and the 31 men who filed into the tent at 6 o'clock ate without much conversation and with the focused efficiency of men who had been working since before dawn. They looked at her with the usual range of expressions, indifference, mild curiosity, the occasional appraisal that she had long since learned to let pass through her without sticking. One man looked at her differently. He was young, 22 or 23, with a narrow build and a watchful quality about him that reminded her of river birds, the ones that stood very still at the water's edge before they moved. He sat at the far end of the second table, and he did not look at her the way the other men did. He looked at her the way someone looks at a person they have been expecting. When he came up to return his tin plate, he paused beside the stove. "Good beans," he said. "Thank you," she said. He hesitated. He had something else to say and was deciding whether to say it. She waited. "You come up the river road today?" he said. "This morning. You see the water?" She looked at him. "I did." He nodded, and there was something in the nod, a relief or a recognition, or both, that she understood without being able to name. He started to speak again, and then boots hit the board floor behind him, and Hollis's voice cut across the tent. "Lyle, you're on the early crew tomorrow. Get some sleep." The young man, Lyle, glanced back at the foreman and then at Nora once more, and the thing he had been about to say went back behind his eyes, and he walked out of the tent into the dark. Nora stood at the stove and listened to the river. It was louder than it had been an hour ago. She was almost certain of it. Nora slept badly and woke before the camp did. She lay still for a moment in the narrow cot she'd been given in the supply tent, a folded horse blanket beneath her, a second one pulled up to her chin, and listened. The river was there in the dark, constant and low, and running beneath everything like a second pulse. She had grown up near water. She knew the difference between a river that was merely present and a river that was working toward something. This one was working. She rose in the cold and dressed by feel and went to start the breakfast fire before the sky had made up its mind about light. The camp occupied a long bench of ground above the Whitmore's eastern bank, or what had been above it when the camp was first staked out in late August. Now, in the second week of October, the bench felt lower. Nora noticed this as she carried water from the barrel behind the cook tent. The ground near the cut bank had a different quality underfoot, a faint give that hadn't been there the day before. Not mud, something beneath the mud. Water pressing upward through the soil the way bread rises, slowly, without announcement, and then all at once. She set the water on and began cutting salt pork. By the time the sky had gone from black to gray to the particular colorless white of an overcast Oregon morning, she had biscuits in the Dutch oven, salt pork crisping in the skillet, and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. The men came to the cook tent in the order that men always came to meals in logging camps, the oldest and most senior first, moving with the economy of people who have learned not to waste effort before a day's work, and the youngest last, still carrying some remnant of sleep in their faces. She watched them without appearing to watch them. There were 14 men in the Whitmore camp, plus the foreman, whose name she had by now corrected in her mind from Garrett Hollis to Caleb Morrow. Clyde Oughton had been wrong about the name, or had been working from old information, or had simply not considered it worth correcting. Morrow ran the camp. She had understood that from the moment he'd walked into the cook tent the night before, not from anything he said, but from the way the tense atmosphere had shifted when he entered it. The way men who had been loose and conversational had become, not afraid exactly, but attentive. He came in last for breakfast, after the crew had eaten and gone. She had expected this. Foremen often ate alone. It was one of the ways they maintained the distance that authority required. What she had not expected was that he would stand at the tent entrance for a moment before sitting, looking at the setup she'd arranged. The stacked tin plates, the coffee pot positioned where it could be reached without crossing in front of the stove, the salt pork kept warm on the back burner. With the expression of a man cataloging what was different, without yet deciding whether different was better or worse. He sat down, and she set a plate in front of him and poured his coffee without being asked. "You moved the table," he said. "It was blocking the flap. If there's a grease fire, men need to be able to get out quickly." He looked at her. "Holt had it there 6 months," he said. "Holt's not here," she said, and went back to the stove. There was a silence. She heard him pick up his fork. "Where'd you cook before this?" he asked. "Harlan for a time. Before that, a sheep camp outside of Bend. Before that, I moved around." She turned the last of the pork in the skillet. "I know how to run a camp kitchen, Mr. Morrow. You'll see that for yourself inside a week." "I expect I will," he said, and that was all. She watched him eat from the corner of her eye. He ate the way he moved, without waste, without particular enjoyment, as though eating were a mechanical requirement he was seeing to before returning to the real business of the day. She had known men like that. They were not unkind. They had simply organized themselves around function so completely that everything else had been crowded out. When he finished, he set his fork down parallel to the plate, a small, precise gesture that she noticed without knowing why she noticed it. "Crew's on the upper slope today," he said. "Lunch needs to go up by wagon at noon. Lyle Hatch will drive you." "I'll need to know the road." "Hatch knows it." He stood, picked up his coffee cup and carried it to the wash basin himself, another thing she hadn't expected, and set it there with the same deliberate quiet that characterized everything he did. He was nearly out of the tent when she said, "Mr. Morrow." He stopped, but didn't turn fully, only enough to indicate he was listening. "The river," she said. "How long has it been running this high?" A pause, not long, but long enough for her to understand that the question had landed differently than he'd anticipated. "It's October," he said. Rain comes in October. The cut bank on the south end of camp is soft, the ground near it too. She kept her voice level. She was not trying to alarm him. She was simply stating what she had observed, the way you stated that a tool was dull or a wheel needed grease. "I've seen river ground behave that way before a rise." He turned then, fully, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not dismissal, but not concern either. Something more like the look of a man who has been told something he already knows and has already decided not to act on. "We've got 2 weeks left in the cut," he said. "Maybe 3 if the weather holds." "I understand that." "The camp's been here since August. River's been high before." "Yes," she said. "I'm sure it has." He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he set his hat on and walked out into the gray morning. The road to the upper slope was a single-track cut through second growth, steep enough in places that the wagon mule leaned into the grade with its neck stretched low and its breathing audible above the wheel noise. Lyle Hatch drove with a loose confidence that suggested he'd made the trip many times and had stopped thinking about it, which Nora considered its own kind of danger. He was young, 20, perhaps 21, with a wide-open face that hadn't yet learned to close itself off from the weather. He had been the one looking at her in the cook tent the night before, the one Morrow had sent to bed. He seemed to have recovered from whatever shyness the foreman's presence had imposed on him. "You talked to Morrow this morning?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I did." "About the river?" She looked at him. "Word travels fast in a small camp." "Morrow came out of the cook tent and stood at the bank for about 2 minutes looking at the water," Lyle said. "Then he went up to the equipment shed. That's the most I've seen him think about something in one go." He glanced at her sideways. "What'd you say to him?" "I told him the cut bank was soft." Lyle was quiet for a stretch, the wagon rocking over a root crossing. "Finch wants the cut finished," he said finally. "That's the man in Portland."
He's got a buyer for the timber, and the contract runs out at the end of the month.
"I know who Finch is." "Then you know Morrow doesn't have a lot of room to move, even if he wanted to." He paused. "He's not a stupid man. He sees the same water you see." "Seeing something and acting on it are different things," Nora said. Lyle didn't answer, and she didn't press it. At the top of the slope, the crew was already 3 hours into the morning's work, and the sound of axes and the long singing pull of cross-cut saws came down through the trees before the wagon was in sight of the clearing. Nora climbed down and began setting up the lunch service on the wagon's tailgate, and the men came down from the cut in pairs and threes, sawdust in their hair, and the particular smell of opened fir wood on their clothes. A clean, resinous smell she had always liked. She watched them, and she fed them, and she listened to what they said to each other when they forgot she was there. The talk was of the timber, of a saw that needed filing, of a man named Morrow who had twisted his knee on a root ball and was working light. There was talk of the weekend, of a card game, of a woman someone knew in a town called Dillard. There was no talk of the river. She looked out from the slope, through the gaps in the fir canopy, and could see the Whitmore from above, a silver-gray thread moving through the valley below, wide and dense and fast. From this height she could see what she could not see from the camp, the way the water was pushing against the outer edge of the bend just south of the camp's position, the way it had already begun to undercut the bank on the far side and deposit that material downstream. The river was not simply high, it was moving laterally. It was finding new geometry. She looked at it for a long time. Then she put the lid back on the soup pot and began loading the empty tins. That evening, after supper, she asked Lyle Hatch where the supply wagon's harness was stored. He looked at her. "In the tack shed. Why?" "I want to know where it is," she said. He studied her face for a moment with those open, not yet closed eyes of his. "Nora," he said, quietly enough that the men nearby wouldn't hear, "Morrow's not going to move the camp. Not with 2 weeks left in the cut." "I know that." "So what are you—" "I'm learning where the harness is," she said. "That's all." She said good night and went back to the cook tent and began her prep for morning. The river was louder again. She was no longer almost certain of it. She was certain. She stood at the tent flap in the dark and looked at the cut bank and thought about the angle of the water against the bend below camp, and the way the soil had given under her boots that morning, and the particular color the Whitmore had taken on in the last hour of daylight, that dark, silted brown that a river only showed when it was pulling material from somewhere upstream that it had no business reaching. Somewhere upstream, something had already given way. The question was only how long before the news of it arrived here. The boy appeared at her fire before sunrise. Nora heard him before she saw him. The particular hesitation of small feet on gravel, the pause and recalibration that children performed when they were uncertain of their welcome. She was working the sourdough, her hands deep in the mass of it, and she did not look up. "You can stand there, or you can make yourself useful," she said. "Either way, don't touch the Dutch oven." A silence. Then the sound of him coming closer. She had noticed him the day before, the thin boy with his father's jaw and his dead mother's watchful eyes, trailing the edges of the camp like a dog that had been shooed away from too many firesides to bother approaching directly. The men tolerated him with the mild, distracted affection of men who had no particular feelings about children one way or another. His father, Wren Oakes, was a broad-shouldered man with a faller's economy of motion, and he spoke to his son in the clipped, practical language of someone who had learned that affection was most safely expressed through instruction. "Hold it this way. Walk there, not there. Don't let Hollis see you idle." The boy came to stand at the edge of her work table, a length of split timber balanced on two sawhorses, and watched her work the dough. "What's your name?" Nora said. Not a question, exactly. "Tommy?" "Tommy what?" "Oakes. Your father's the faller." She turned the dough, pressed the heel of her hand into it. "You eat breakfast yet?" "No, ma'am." "Then you're useful."
Fill that pot from the near bucket, not the far one, and set it on the left grate, not the right. He did it without asking why, which told her something. He was precise about it, too, measured the distance from the grate edge by eye before setting the pot down, adjusting it a half-inch to center the weight. 11 years old and already calibrating. "Why not the far bucket?" he said when he'd finished. "Far bucket's for washing. Near bucket's from upstream of the camp. Cleaner." "How do you know which is which? They look the same." "The far bucket has a nick in the left handle where someone dropped it on a rock. The near bucket doesn't." She glanced at him. "Now you know." He absorbed this with the particular stillness of a child filing information away for later use. He stood with his hands at his sides, not fidgeting, watching her work. "You can slice that salt pork," Nora said. "Even slices, thin as you can make them." She handed him the smaller of her knives, not the sharpest, but a good knife, and she watched from the corner of her eye as he took it with appropriate care, tested the edge with the pad of his thumb the way she'd done it, and then began to cut. His first slice was uneven. He looked at it, looked at the pork, and adjusted his angle on the second. By the fourth slice he had found the rhythm of it. She turned back to her dough and said nothing, which was its own form of approval. The morning passed in the way mornings at the camp had begun to pass, with the noise of men eating, the clatter of tools being gathered, the foreman's voice moving through it all like a plow through heavy ground, steady and indifferent to what it turned up. Morrow ate last, as he had the day before, and when he left the tent he paused at the entrance and looked at the river. Nora watched him look. He was not seeing what she was seeing. She could tell by the way his gaze moved, a quick, habitual scan, the kind a man performed not to gather information, but to confirm the absence of immediate catastrophe. The river was still there. The river was not in the camp. Therefore, the river was fine. He walked on. Tommy appeared at her elbow with the empty bread tins. "Where do these go?" he asked. "Stack them on the second shelf, not the first." "First shelf catches water when it rains and the tins rust." He went to do it, and Nora untied her apron and walked to the edge of the camp, to the place where the ground began its subtle slope toward the cut bank. She had been here 3 times now. Once in the dark before dawn on her first morning, once in the gray light of yesterday's evening, and now in the flat, white glare of a clouded morning. Each time the thing she was measuring had changed. The cut bank had lost another 2 inches of height, not from erosion at the top, from the bottom, from the ground compressing under the weight of water pressing up through the substrate. She crouched and pressed her fingers into the soil. It yielded in the way that soil did not naturally yield, with a softness that was not softness but saturation, the earth so thoroughly infiltrated with water that the distinction between ground and river was becoming a matter of opinion. She stood and looked upstream. The Whitmore bent hard to the left about a quarter-mile north, and beyond that bend she could not see. But she did not need to see. The river's color had deepened overnight. The sound of it had changed, a lower register beneath the surface chatter, a bass note that she felt more than heard, the sound of volume and weight moving faster than they should. She had grown up on the Rogue, 200 miles south. She had watched that river rise and fall and rise again through 12 years of childhood before she understood that what she was watching was not the river's behavior, but its communication. The Rogue had taught her to read it the way a patient teacher taught a slow student, through repetition, through consequence, through the particular education of having once stood in the wrong place and been knocked flat by water that had given no warning she was equipped to recognize. She was equipped now. She turned and walked back to camp. Garrett Hollis was not the foreman. He was the foreman's problem, which was a different thing entirely. Nora had assembled her understanding of him from pieces, the way Morrow's jaw set when Hollis's name was mentioned, the careful neutrality with which the older loggers referred to him, the exaggerated deference of the younger ones. Hollis was the camp's owner in absentia, a man who appeared every 10 days to review the board footage and review the accounts and make pronouncements that Morrow then had to engineer the reality to match. He had arrived that afternoon on a horse that was too good for the road and wearing boots that were too clean for the camp, and he had gone directly to Morrow's tent without looking at anything else. Nora heard them through the canvas. She was not trying to hear them. The camp was not large. "Footage is down," Hollis said. 3 days of rain set us back." Morrow's voice was level. "We'll make it up." "I didn't ask for an explanation. I asked for the numbers." A pause, the rustling of paper. "You're behind by 8,000 board feet." "I know what I'm behind by." "Then you know I need it made up before the end of the month." Another pause, longer. "What's the situation with the cook?" "She's competent." "I heard she's been asking questions about the river." Nora's hands went still on the pot she was scrubbing. "She mentioned the water level," Morrow said. "It's a reasonable observation." "The river's been running high." "It's been running high every spring since before either of us was born," Hollis said. "I don't need a cook who's going to put ideas in the men's heads about flooding. We lose a week to some woman's nerves, and I'm not paying for it." "She hasn't said anything to the men." "See that she doesn't." Nora set the pot down with more care than the gesture required. She dried her hands on her apron and stood for a moment looking at nothing in particular, calibrating. Then Tommy appeared at her side, having materialized in the soundless way he had developed, and held out the stack of plates she'd asked him to retrieve from the supply tent. "I heard," he said. She looked at him. He looked back with his mother's eyes, steady and dark, and carrying more than an 11-year-old should have been carrying. "How much?" she said. "Enough." He set the plates on the table. "Is the river going to flood?" She considered lying. She considered the economy of it, the convenience, the way a lie would simplify the next several days. She considered the fact that this boy had learned to calibrate pot placement and knife angles and shelf drainage patterns in a single morning, and that a lie told to a child like this was not a kindness, but an injury. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "When?" "I don't know exactly. Soon." She picked up the first plate and began to dry it. "Days, not weeks." "Does Mr. Morrow know?" "Mr. Morrow knows I think so. That's not the same thing as knowing." Tommy was quiet for longer this time. She could hear him working through it. The particular quality of that silence was not fear, but calculation, which was more useful and more worrying in equal measure. "My dad's tent is close to the river," he said. "I know where your father's tent is." "Could I move it?" She looked at him again. He was asking her permission, not his father's, not Morrow's, hers, because she was the one who had told him the truth, and therefore the one whose authority in this matter he recognized. "You can move it," she said. "Move it tonight, after your father's asleep if you have to. Tell him the ground felt wet if he asks."
That part's even true. He nodded once with the seriousness of a man receiving instructions and began to stack the dried plates. Hollis came to the cook tent before supper. He was a tall man, not unhandsome, with the particular confidence of someone who had never been required to doubt himself in any practical way. He looked at the tent, at the arrangement of the equipment, at Nora herself with the assessing gaze of a man pricing livestock. "You're the cook," he said. "Yes?" "Morrow says you're competent." "I am." He smiled at that, a brief, thin thing. "I'll be the judge of that. I also hear you've been concerning yourself with the river." Nora was stirring the pot. She did not stop stirring. "The river's worth concerning yourself with." "The Whitmore floods its banks every 4 or 5 years, Hollis said, with the patience of a man explaining arithmetic to someone slow. "It rises in spring, it recedes in summer. This is not a mystery. The camp has been in this location for 6 years, and it is never flooded." "The camp has been lucky for 6 years," Nora said. The smile disappeared. "I'll thank you to keep your opinions about the river to yourself and your attention on the food. That's what you're paid for." He left without waiting for her response, which was its own kind of answer. The answer of a man who had made a decision and did not wish to be interrupted by facts. Nora stood at the stove and listened to the river. It was louder than it had been this morning, not dramatically so, not the roaring, obvious loudness of a river in visible crisis, but louder in that lower register, that bass note beneath the surface sound, the note she had first heard 2 days ago, and which had been deepening with the steady, unhurried patience of a thing that did not need anyone's permission to continue. She looked at the camp through the tent opening. 14 men and a boy. 4 tents within 30 feet of the cut bank. The supply wagon, the equipment shed, the stacked timber waiting for the road. Morrow's tent at the camp's center. Hollis already on his horse and riding back toward town, his clean boots catching the last of the light. She thought about what it meant to know something that the people around you had decided not to know. She had said days, not weeks, to Tommy, and she had meant it. But standing here now, listening to the register of the water, she felt the first cold revision of that estimate begin to move through her like a current. Days was generous. She turned back to the stove, and it was then that she heard it. A sound from upstream, distant but distinct, carrying over the ordinary noise of the camp and the river both. A low, concussive report, like the earth clearing its throat, the sound of something large giving way.
The bell's note hung in the cold air and then dissolved, and for a moment the camp did not respond at all. Then it did, in the way camps respond to unexpected sounds, not with urgency, but with irritation. She heard boots on the duckboards, the complaint of a tent flap, someone's voice asking, "What the hell?" The ordinary machinery of 14 men interrupted. Nora set the ladle down on the workboard and walked to the tent door and stood there, looking upstream. The sound had not repeated. The river ran as it had run a moment ago, wide and dark and carrying more than it should. But there was nothing she could point to, no visible collapse, no sudden surge, no wall of water descending through the firs. Only the sound which she had heard, and which had meant something, and which was already being swallowed by the ordinary noise of morning. Caleb Morrow came across the yard with his coffee still in his hand. "Bell rang," he said. "Yes." "Breakfast isn't ready." "No, I heard something upstream. A report, something giving way. I thought the camp should know." Morrow looked at her the way he looked at the river, briefly, functionally, already composing his return to other concerns. "Probably a snag. Trees come down in high water. It happens." "It didn't sound like a tree." "What did it sound like?" She considered lying, or softening it, and decided against both. "It sounded like a cut bank going," she said, "or a log jam breaking loose." Something that had been holding and then stopped. He looked at her for a moment longer than he had before, and she thought she had him. Thought the word log jam had found a crack in his certainty. Because a log jam breaking loose was a thing with practical consequences even men like Morrow took seriously. But then the moment passed. "I'll send Decker up the bank to look," he said, and turned back toward the crew tent. It was not nothing, she told herself that. It was not nothing that he was sending anyone at all. Wren Oakes heard the bell from his bunk and did not move for 3 full seconds, which was the time it took him to determine that the quality of the sound was not fire and not injury, and was therefore not worth the particular urgency that would have gotten him upright faster than his back could object. He sat up slowly, a man assembling himself from parts that had been stored at odd angles, and pulled on his boots and came out into the yard, squinting. He was a large man, not tall in the way that draws attention, but wide through the chest and shoulders in the way that suggests the frame was built for a purpose and has been used accordingly. 40 years of use, most of it outdoors, much of it in conditions that would have simplified a smaller man. His face was weathered to the color and texture of the bark on a fir tree, and he wore it with the same indifference. He had been at the Whitmore camp for 11 days, which was long enough to have formed opinions about everything in it, including the new cook. His opinion of the new cook was that she was competent enough and quiet enough, and that the less said about the strangeness of her being there, the better. His opinion of this morning was that the bell had rung for no good reason, and that he had been in the middle of a dream he could not now recall, but which had felt, for a moment, like something he had lost. He found Morrow near the supply tent, talking to young Decker, who was nodding in the way young Decker nodded when he was being given instructions he would carry out with more enthusiasm than judgment. "What's the trouble?" Wren asked. "Cook heard something upstream." "Decker's going to walk the bank and have a look." Wren looked toward the cook tent. The woman, Vass, he had been told her name was standing in the tent door with her arms at her sides, watching Decker head up toward the river.
She had the posture of someone who wanted to say more and had decided not to. He knew that posture. He had spent 20 years married to it. The thought arrived without warning, and he let it pass through him without expression, which was the only technique he had developed for managing such arrivals. He looked away from her and back at Morrow. "High water," Morrow said preemptively. "She's been worried about the river since she got here. It's her first season camp." "She's a camp cook," Wren said. "Not a riverman." "No," Morrow agreed. They stood together in the comfortable silence of two men who had confirmed a shared position, and Wren felt the small, solid satisfaction of the world behaving as expected. The river was high. It was the season for high rivers. The cook had rung a bell because she was new and nervous, and Decker would walk the bank and come back with nothing to report, and breakfast would eventually appear, and the day would proceed.
These things he understood.
Decker came back in 20 minutes. "Snag," he said. "Big cedar, maybe 60 feet. Came down about a quarter-mile up. Took some bank with it when it went." "Current fast?" Morrow asked. "Faster than yesterday, but the channel's holding." Morrow nodded. That was the end of it. Nora heard this exchange from the cook tent where she was finishing the breakfast she had delayed. She heard the word snag and heard the word holding, and heard, beneath both of those words, the thing that neither Decker nor Morrow had said, because neither of them had thought to look for it. That a 60-foot cedar taking bank with it on its way down meant the substrate was already compromised at the quarter-mile mark, which meant the saturation she had identified at the cut bank below camp was not a local condition. It was continuous. It ran the length of the bend. She put the biscuits on the board and rang the bell properly for breakfast and watched the men come. Wren Oakes ate the way he did everything, steadily, without waste, attending to the task. He sat at the end of the long table with Tommy beside him, and Tommy was unusually quiet this morning, which Wren noted without commenting on, because commenting on Tommy's silences had never once produced useful information, and generally produced the opposite of whatever it was Wren had been hoping for. The cook moved around the table, refilling coffee, and when she reached Wren's end, she paused. "Mr. Oakes," she said. It was the first time she had addressed him directly by name. He looked up. "I want to ask you something," she said. "And I'd like you to hear it as a practical question and not as an argument." He felt the men around him go slightly still, in the way men go still when they sense a scene forming. He did not want a scene. He set down his fork. "Ask it," he said. "The cedar that came down this morning. Decker said it took bank with it." "That's what he said." "How far is the timber operation from the river, the active cutting?" He looked at her. The question was not what he had expected. "Half-mile, give or take."
Why? Because if the bank is going at the quarter-mile mark, and the ground is already saturated at the cut bank below camp, the water table under this whole section of valley floor is higher than it should be by a significant margin. That means the road that runs along the river, the one the supply wagons use, is sitting on ground that is losing its structural integrity from underneath. She said it evenly, without drama, as if she were describing something she had read in a manual. "I'm not talking about the river overtopping its banks. I'm talking about the ground itself becoming unreliable, which affects the wagons, which affects the timber operation, which is your concern, not mine." The silence at the table had changed character. It was no longer the silence of men watching a scene.
It was the silence of men doing arithmetic. Wren Oakes looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without effort, without challenge, simply held it. And he had the sudden and unwelcome sensation that she had said this particular thing to him specifically, because she had identified him as the man whose opinion would carry weight if it shifted, and that she was not wrong about that.
It made him angry in a way he could not entirely account for. "You're a cook," he said. It came out harder than he'd intended. "Yes," she said, "I am. And breakfast is getting cold." She moved on down the table with the coffee pot. He picked up his fork. Around him the men resumed eating, and the conversation resumed at the low, practical register of men who had decided not to think about something. And Wren ate his breakfast and did not look at her again, and told himself that the irritation he felt was reasonable, that a cook had no business making assessments about ground stability and water tables, that Morrow had been running river camps for 15 years, and would know if there were genuine cause for concern. He told himself these things with the particular thoroughness of a man who is working against something. Tommy found her at the river. She was standing at the cut bank, not the same spot she had measured that morning, but 6 feet downstream from it, which was where the bank now ended. 6 feet of it were gone. Not crumbled in the way of ordinary erosion, but simply absent, as if the ground had quietly decided to become water while no one was watching. Tommy stood beside her and looked at the place where the bank had been. "It was there this morning," he said. "Yes. Does my father know?" Nora looked downstream toward the camp. She could see the smoke from the cook tent, the small figures of men moving between the equipment shed and the timber road, the ordinary, purposeful activity of a camp that believed it understood its circumstances. "I told him what I know," she said. "What he does with it is his to decide." Tommy was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the river the way he had looked at everything she'd shown him this morning, with the careful, absorbing attention of someone who was building a picture rather than just collecting facts. "It's going to flood," he said. It was not a question. She did not answer immediately, because the honest answer had changed since this morning, and she was still adjusting to it. "Yes," she said. "When?" She looked at the place where 6 feet of bank had been at breakfast, and was not now, and thought about the cedar a quarter-mile upstream that had taken its section of bank with it, and thought about the continuous saturation she had traced in her mind along the full length of the bend, and thought about the sound she had heard before she rang the bell, that low, concussive report, like the earth clearing its throat. She had revised her estimate once already today. "Before dark," she said. Tommy said nothing. He stood very still beside her, the way he stood when he was deciding something. And then he turned and walked back toward camp, not running, but walking with the particular deliberateness of a boy who has somewhere specific to be. Nora stayed at the bank another moment, watching the river. The color had changed again. It was no longer the deep green-brown of fast water carrying sediment. It was the color of the soil itself, the color of everything upstream that was no longer where it had been. And it was moving with a low, pressurized urgency that had nothing left of the ordinary in it. She turned and followed Tommy back toward camp. Behind her, in the few seconds it took to walk 10 paces, the cut bank gave another 6 inches. She did not see it, but she heard it, the small,
intimate sound of the earth releasing something it had been holding for a long time. She did not slow her pace. She walked faster. The letter arrived with the supply wagon on Thursday. Nora knew it had come before she saw it. She knew from the way Morrow's posture changed when Clyde Otten handed him the envelope, a slight squaring of the shoulders that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with preparation. He tucked it into his coat pocket without opening it and went back to directing the unloading of the flour sacks, but the letter was already doing its work. She could see it in the set of his jaw for the rest of the morning. She said nothing. She took inventory of the new supplies, noted what was missing from her list, the second sack of cornmeal again, and began planning the week's meals around the absence. There was a kind of arithmetic to feeding 14 men in a remote camp that had nothing to do with recipes and everything to do with substitution, and Nora had become fluent in it faster than she had expected. What she had not expected was how much of her mind would remain elsewhere, fixed on the river the way a tongue finds a loose tooth. She had not stopped watching it. She had simply learned to watch it without appearing to. Morrow read the letter that evening, sitting at the small folding table he used as a desk at the far end of the equipment shelter. Nora saw the lamplight from across the yard when she stepped out to check the water barrel, and she saw the shape of him bent over the page, one hand pressed flat against the table as if steadying himself. She went back inside. The next morning, before the crew had finished eating, Morrow called across the cook tent without looking up from his coffee. "Otten says you shorted the cornmeal order again." "Otten shorted the cornmeal order," Nora said, without heat. "I wrote 2 sacks. He brought 1. It's the second week running." "I'll look into it." "I'd appreciate that. I can stretch what I have, but not indefinitely." Morrow nodded once, in the clipped way that meant the subject was closed, and Nora let it close. She had learned the economy of his attention. There was only so much of it, and pushing past its natural limit produced nothing useful. She refilled his coffee without being asked, and when he looked up at her briefly, something shifted in his expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite apology, but occupied the narrow space between them. "Finch wants the east section cleared by the 22nd, he said. It was not directed at her. It was the kind of statement a man makes to the middle distance when he is thinking aloud and has forgotten, momentarily, that he is not alone. Nora recognized it and treated it accordingly. She did not respond, but she did not pretend she hadn't heard. "That's 9 days, she said after a moment. 8, if you count right." "I count from today." He looked at her. 8 days, he said. "Yes." She set the coffee pot down on the iron trivet and picked up her cloth. "How far along is the east section?" 60%, maybe 65. He said it like a man confessing something. "We lost 2 days last week to the skid road washing out. Finch doesn't account for skid roads in his calculations." "Finch doesn't account for much that isn't a number on a page." Nora said nothing. She had never heard Morrow say anything critical of the camp's ownership before, had not, in fact, heard him say much of anything that wasn't operational. And she understood instinctively that this was not an invitation to discuss it further. It was a pressure valve, nothing more. She wiped down the table beside him and moved away. She heard the men talking about it at lunch. Not about Finch directly, they didn't use his name, but about the push, the new timeline, the foreman's mood since morning. Decker sat at the end of the bench with his elbows on the table, speaking in the low, rapid way he had when he was working himself up to something. 8 days is 8 days, he said. We've done worse. Not with a wet skid road, said a man named Pell, who was older and had a deliberate way of eating that suggested he had learned to take his time with things. That road goes soft again. We lose another day easy, maybe 2. Then we don't let it go soft. You going to hold the rain back, Decker? Nora set a pan of biscuits on the table without comment.
Tommy Oakes was at the near end of the bench, and she caught his eye briefly. He was listening with the same focused attention he brought to everything. Not anxious, not excited, simply absorbing. She had noticed that about him. He was a boy who catalogued things. She found it reassuring and, in the current circumstances, faintly heartbreaking. Wren Oakes, seated across from his son, was not talking. He was eating steadily, with his eyes on his plate, and Nora had learned to pay attention to Wren's silences the same way she paid attention to the river's sounds. They were informative in proportion to what they were replacing. She refilled the water pitcher at the end of the table, and as she passed behind Wren, he said, quietly and without turning his head, "River's up another inch since yesterday." She stopped. "I know," she said. He nodded, still not looking at her. "Thought you might." She moved on. She did not look back at him. But something in her chest that had been wound tight for 4 days loosened by a single, almost imperceptible degree. Not enough to matter, not enough to change anything, but enough to register. Someone else had noticed. She went to Morrow that afternoon. She had weighed it carefully, the way she weighed everything. The cost of speaking against the cost of silence, the diminishing return of warnings that had already been dismissed, the specific arithmetic of what she now knew against what she had known 4 days ago when she had first tried to tell him. The calculation had changed. The river had continued to change it, daily and without negotiation, and she had reached the point where the weight of not speaking had finally exceeded the weight of speaking and being ignored. He was at the river's edge, walking the bank with Pell and one of the younger men, checking the skid road approach. She waited until Pell had moved off before she came alongside him. "Mr. Morrow." He glanced at her. Foremen at logging camps were not accustomed to their cooks appearing at the worksite, and she saw the faint recalibration in his expression, not unwelcoming, but uncertain. "Miss Vass?" "I need to say something to you, and I need you to hear it differently than you heard it before." He was quiet for a moment. The river moved beside them, that low, pressurized sound she had been tracking for days, the sound that had no business being as loud as it was at this time of year, with no rain in the last 48 hours. "All right," he said. "The cut bank opposite the equipment shelter has dropped 8 inches in 4 days. Not from the top, from the bottom, which means the water table is pushing up through the substrate. The river's color has been deepening since Monday. It's running faster than the surface looks, which means there's volume moving underneath that isn't visible. And this morning, the ground between the cook tent and the water barrel had standing water in it that wasn't there yesterday, and wasn't there because of rain." She stopped. She had rehearsed this, had stripped it of everything that could be dismissed as feeling or intuition, had reduced it to the observable facts the way her father had taught her to. Don't tell them what you think, tell them what you can prove, and let them think it themselves. Morrow was looking at the river. "The Whitmore floods," he said. "It floods every few years. The camp's been here 3 seasons without incident." "I know." I'm not telling you the river floods. I'm telling you it's going to flood before the 22nd. The number landed between them with a particular weight, and she watched him absorb it. watched him understand that she had heard him that morning, that she had been doing the same arithmetic he had been doing, and that her conclusion was not the same as his. "Finch wants the east section cleared," he said. It was not an argument. It was something closer to an explanation, or perhaps a confession. "I understand that." "If I pull the crew off the east section—" "I'm not asking you to pull the crew off anything," she said. "I'm asking you to move the equipment. The skid donkey, the cable reels, the fuel stores. Move them to the upper yard, above the tree line. It takes half a day. It doesn't stop the work." He looked at her then, fully, in the way he hadn't before, without the slight angle of dismissal that had been present in every previous exchange about this subject. She held his gaze steadily and waited. "If you're wrong," he said, "I've lost half a day and Finch has another complaint to put in a letter." "Yes?" "And if you're right—" It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "If I'm right, and the equipment is in the upper yard, you lose the skid road and possibly the lower tent line, but you keep the machinery and you keep the men." She paused. "If I'm right, and the equipment is where it is now, you lose everything below the second terrace, and you don't finish the east section by the 22nd or by any other date Finch cares to name." The river ran beside them, low and urgent, and full of something it wasn't showing. Morrow said nothing for a long time. She could see him turning it over, the letter in his coat pocket, the 8 days, the 65%, the half-day cost of moving equipment against the incalculable cost of losing it. She could see the shape of the decision forming, and she waited with the particular patience of someone who has said everything she can say and must now let the other person arrive at the place she has already been standing. "I'll think about it," he said. It was not yes. She had known it would not be yes, not immediately, not from a man like Morrow, who made decisions the way the camp made lumber, through a process that could not be rushed without risk of the whole thing coming apart. "Thank you," she said, and meant it, and walked back toward the cook tent. Behind her, she heard him say her name once, "Miss Vass," and she turned. He was still looking at the river. "How long," he said, "in your estimation?" She looked at the water, at the color of it, at the way it moved against the far bank with a kind of quiet insistence, like something that had already made up its mind. "3 days," she said. 4 at the outside." He nodded once, the same way he had nodded that morning. She could not tell from the nod what it meant. She went back to start dinner. That night the second letter arrived, not by wagon, by a rider, a young man she didn't recognize who came into camp just after dark with mud on his boots and a sealed envelope that he handed to Morrow without a word. Nora watched from the cook tent doorway as Morrow took it, watched the rider turn and go back the way he had come, watched Morrow stand alone in the middle of the yard with the envelope in his hand and the lamplight from the equipment shelter falling across one side of his face. He did not open it immediately. He stood there for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, the envelope held loosely at his side. And in that moment, Nora had the distinct and unsettling impression of a man standing at the edge of something he could not yet see the bottom of. Then he went inside. She turned back to the stove. She banked the fire for the night, covered the morning's dough, checked the water level in the barrel, and stopped. The water barrel was full. She had filled it herself at midday from the camp's upper cistern, and it was full now,
which was not remarkable. What was remarkable was the thin line of silt along the inside of the barrel, 3 inches above where the water currently sat. She stared at it. The barrel had not been moved. No one had added water. The level had not risen. It had, if anything, dropped slightly through the afternoon's use. The silt line was not from this barrel. It was from the ground beneath it. Groundwater wicking upward through the barrel's wooden base, depositing its fine sediment at the high water mark of the pressure below. The water table had reached the cook tent. She set down the cloth she was holding and looked at the door. 3 days, she had told him. She was no longer certain she had 3 days. The morning Nora walked into Harlan, she told herself she would not stay long enough to be known there. She had been wrong about that, apparently. The supply wagon came in every 9 or 10 days, and Clyde Otten always stopped at May Dunnett's general store on Harlan's Main Street before he made the camp run. It was where he collected the dry goods order: flour, salt, cornmeal, dried beans, the occasional luxury of canned peaches when the budget allowed. He had told Nora this on her second week, mentioned it in the way men mention things they assume you already understand, and she had filed it away without comment. She had not planned to come into town, but the water table had reached the cook tent, and she had lain awake the entire night staring at the canvas above her, doing arithmetic. And by 4 in the morning she had made a decision. It was not a comfortable decision. It was simply the only one remaining. She left Tommy Oakes a note. "Oatmeal in the pot. Keep the fire low. Don't let it scorch," and climbed up onto the wagon seat beside Otten before he had fully woken up. He looked at her sideways. "You're coming in? I need to send a telegraph." He waited, as men like Otten waited, to see if more information was forthcoming. When it wasn't, he clicked his tongue at the horse and let it go. May Dunnett's general store occupied the widest building on Harlan's Main Street, which was not saying a great deal. The town was 3 blocks of ambition that had run out somewhere around 1891 and not recovered. But the store was solid, its shelves well ordered, its floorboards clean, and May herself stood behind the counter at 8 in the morning with the settled authority of a woman who had opened this store every day for 22 years and intended to continue doing so until she died, or the town did, whichever came second. She was 55, with gray-streaked hair pinned with absolute precision, and a way of looking at a person that suggested she was simultaneously taking their measure and filing them under the appropriate heading. Nora had been in the store exactly once before, the morning she arrived in Harlan, when she had stood at the counter and asked if there was any work to be had, and May had looked at her traveling clothes and her worn bag and said, with genuine neutrality, "The stump might know of something." Not unkind. Not kind, either. Categorical. Nora pushed open the door now and heard the bell above it. May looked up. Something shifted slightly in her expression, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. "Mrs. Vass?" she said. That she knew the name was not remarkable. Otten bought supplies from her. Men talked. Harlan was small. But there was something in the use of it, the Mrs. placed with particular care, like a piece of furniture moved to the center of the room to be examined, that told Nora she had been discussed. "Good morning," Nora said. "I need to use the telegraph. Otten tells me you have the line." "I do." May did not move immediately. "You're down from the Whitmore camp?" "Yes." "Come in on supply day?" "Yes." May looked at her for a moment longer.
that precise, filing look, and then came around the counter and walked to the back of the store where the telegraph equipment sat on a small, dedicated table beside a locked cabinet. She settled into the chair there with the manner of a woman who had sent 1,000 messages and found most of them unnecessary. "Who are you sending to?" "The County Land Office in Roseburg, and then the Oregon and Pacific Freight Office if there's time." May's hands, which had been reaching for the key, paused. "The Land Office," she repeated. "I want to report a flood risk on the Whitmore River. The camp is in the lower bend. If the county has a survey on file, they'll know the elevation. Someone there will understand what I'm telling them." The silence in the store was the particular silence of a small room in a small town where information has weight and travels far. "You're reporting a flood," May said. "Not a question, not agreement. A restatement, the way you repeat something back to determine whether you've heard it correctly."
"The river is going to breach the cut bank," Nora said. "I don't know exactly when. I believe it will be within 48 hours, possibly less. The camp is in the flood path." May looked at her. The filing look had changed to something else, something more complicated, in which several categories were being consulted simultaneously, and none of them quite fitting. "Does Morrow know you're here?" "No." "Does he know about the flood?" "I've told him 3 times. The last time was 4 days ago." Nora paused. "He doesn't believe me." May was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully, "Mrs. Vass, you've been at that camp, 3 weeks?" 22 days. "And Caleb Morrow has been running river camps for—" "I know how long he's been running camps," Nora said. "I'm not disputing his experience. I'm telling you what I've observed." She kept her voice even. She had rehearsed this, in the dark, in the wagon, in the cold. She had known this was the conversation she would have to have. "The cut bank has lost 4 inches of height from the bottom up. The water table reached the cook tent floor 2 nights ago. The river's color has changed. The sound has changed." "I grew up on the Coquille. I know what a river looks like when it's preparing to move." Something passed across May Dunnett's face. It was not quite belief. It was not quite dismissal. It was the expression of a woman who had lived long enough to know that categories were useful tools, and not infallible ones. "The Coquille," she said. "My father ran a ferry crossing for 15 years. Before that, his father. I've seen it 3 times. Nora held the woman's gaze. "I'm not hysterical. I'm not imagining it. And I'm not asking Caleb Morrow's permission to send this message." The clock on the wall ticked. May Dunnett looked at her hands, then at the telegraph key, then back at Nora. Whatever she was filing her under now, it was a different category than the one she'd had before. "Sit down," May said. Nora sat. May sent the message to the County Land Office in Roseburg. She sent it precisely, without editorializing, and she read the reply when it came. A standard acknowledgement, a promise to forward to the district surveyor, a timeline of 3 to 5 business days that made Nora's jaw tighten visibly. 3 to 5 days, Nora said.
"That's the county," May said, in the tone of a woman who had dealt with the county before. "Send the one to the freight office." May sent it. The Oregon and Pacific Freight Office replied more quickly. They had equipment and men staged at the Whitmore River crossing downstream, and a flood event would be a material concern to them. The reply asked for specifics of elevation and timeline. Nora provided what she could. The exchange took 20 minutes. When it was done, she sat back. "They'll send someone to look," May said. "The freight office, at least. They have reason to." "By the time someone looks—" Nora stopped. She looked at the window, at the pale morning light on the street outside. "It may not matter." May was quiet for a moment. Then she said, unexpectedly, "My husband died in a river." Nora looked at her. 1893, spring thaw. He was not a foolish man. May's voice was entirely level, entirely without self-pity, in the way that grief becomes level after enough years. He had worked that stretch of the Umpqua for 12 seasons. He knew it. She paused. He didn't know it that morning. Nora said nothing. "I am not saying I believe you," May said. "I am saying that I understand the argument you're making." She looked at Nora directly. "What are you going to do when you get back?" "I'm going to tell Morrow again." "And if he doesn't listen again?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "Then I'm going to start moving what I can. Food stores, tools, the things that can be carried. If I can get Tommy Oakes to help me—" She stopped. "There are 14 men in that camp. If the river comes in the night—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. May Dunnett stood up. She went to the shelves behind the counter and began pulling items down with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent decades knowing exactly where everything was. A coil of good rope, 2 lanterns, a tin of dry matches sealed with wax, a canvas bag. Nora watched her. "I'm not sending you back up there empty-handed," May said without turning around. "Whatever Caleb Morrow thinks of your judgment, there is no reason you should be without a rope." She set the items on the counter. "That's $3.40. I'll put it on the camp account and Otten can argue with Finch about it later." It was not an apology. It was not a declaration of belief. It was May Dunnett doing what May Dunnett did, being precise about what was practical and letting that stand in for the softer things she did not easily say. Nora stood up and put her hand on the rope. "Thank you," she said. May looked at her with that measuring expression, and this time what she filed her under was something she did not name aloud. "You'd better get back," she said. "Otten will be loading up." The wagon road back to camp ran along the high ridge above the river valley for the first 4 miles, and from it, on a clear day, you could see the Whitmore River below, a gray-green thread moving through the dark fir and alder, carrying its freight of snow melt and rain toward the coast. Nora looked down at it. The river was not gray-green today. It was the color of wet clay, opaque and heavy, and it was moving with a speed that was visible even from this distance, the kind of speed that didn't look like speed until you noticed that the surface was not rippling. It was sliding, the whole mass of it sliding downriver like something that had decided to stop pretending it had edges. She watched it for the length of time it took the wagon to pass the overlook. Then she turned forward and looked at the road ahead, and her hands in her lap were very still, and she did not let herself calculate again how long she had, because she already knew the answer, and the answer was not enough time. And she had known it since 4 o'clock this morning, and knowing it again would not help. What would help was getting back to camp before Morrow left for the east section. What would help was finding the right words. Not the words she'd been using, which were the right words and had not worked. But some other arrangement of them, some angle of approach she hadn't tried. What would help, she thought, was if the river would wait. But she had spent 22 days watching it, and she already knew the river was not going to wait. She heard it before she saw it, a sound from below, low, percussive, wrong in the way that sounds are wrong when the landscape makes them and not any human thing. Not the crack of a falling tree, not the clap of a logjam breaking. Something larger, something foundational. Otten heard it too. He pulled up on the reins without being asked, and the horse stopped, ears forward, body rigid. They sat in the sudden silence. And then the ridge beneath the wagon trembled, not dramatically, not enough to unseat them, but enough. A shiver in the earth felt through the wagon boards and the soles of her boots, the kind of shiver that meant something very large had just moved somewhere below. Nora was off the wagon before Otten could speak. She ran to the edge of the overlook and looked down. The river had not breached, not yet, but the cut bank on the near side of the camp bend, the cut bank she had measured, had watched, had reported, had collapsed along a 30-foot section, and the water was pouring through the gap with the unhurried inevitability of something that had been waiting a long time for permission. The camp was visible from here, small, quiet, still. No bell, no movement, no sign that anyone down there had heard what she had heard. She turned back to the wagon. "Otten," she said. Her voice was entirely calm. "Drive." The wagon came down the switchback at a speed Otten would not have chosen for himself. But he drove it anyway, because the woman beside him had spoken in that particular register, the one that had no argument in it, no negotiation, no space for his own assessment of the situation. He had heard that voice from foremen and from sergeants and once from a doctor, and he had learned in each instance to do what it said. The grade leveled out onto the river road, and the horses felt the change and leaned into it, and Nora gripped the buckboard rail and watched the tree line for the gap in the firs that marked the camp access trail. "How bad?" Otten said. "The cut bank on the near bend. 30 feet, maybe more, already gone." She kept her eyes on the trees. "The water's through the substrate. It won't stop at 30 feet. Otten said nothing for a moment. Then, "Morrow know?" "Morrow knows what he's decided to know," she pointed. "There, left." He pulled the team left onto the narrow trail, and the canopy closed over them, and the light went green and close. The wheels found the ruts, and the wagon lurched and groaned, and from somewhere ahead, not far, perhaps half a mile, there came a sound that was not the wind, and not the trees, and not anything a man would make. It was low and continuous, and it had the quality of mass in motion, of something very large doing something it had been building toward for a long time. Nora heard it, and her hands tightened on the rail. "Stop here," she said. "We're not—" "Stop the wagon, Otten. If the trail floods, you'll lose the team." He stopped. She was already climbing down before the wheels had fully settled, her boots hitting the soft ground, and she turned back once. "Get the horses to high ground. The ridge trail, back the way we came. There's a clearing at the first switchback." She did not wait for his answer. She was already moving through the trees toward the camp. She heard the bell before she saw the cook tent. One ring, then two, then a frantic, irregular clanging that meant someone had finally understood. She She came through the last stand of firs at a near run and found the camp in the early stages of a chaos that had not yet organized itself into anything useful. Men were standing outside the bunkhouse, looking toward the river. 2 of them were still holding coffee cups. Decker was on the steps of the equipment shed with his mouth open. The river sound was much louder here, a deep, insistent percussion that the trees had muffled on the trail, but that the open ground of the camp let in fully, and several of the men were looking around with the particular expression of people who have just realized that a noise they have been hearing for some time has changed its character. Pete Garza was the one ringing the bell. He had both hands on the rope, and he was ringing it with the methodical, unceasing commitment of a man who had decided that this was his job right now and intended to do it correctly. When he saw Nora come through the tree line, he stopped. "I heard it," he said. His voice was steady. "About 4 minutes ago. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't right." "Where's Morrow?" "Riverside. He went to look." "Tommy Oakes?" "Inside." Pete jerked his head toward the cook tent. "I put him there when I started ringing. Didn't know what else to do with him." She crossed to him in 3 steps. "Listen to me. The supply trail is flooded, or will be within minutes. There is a logging road that runs north from the equipment shed. Pell knows it. It goes to the upper camp at Ridgemont. That road is high ground. Do you understand?" "Yes." "I need you to get every man who will move onto that road. Not toward the river, not toward the supply trail. North. Tell them north." Pete Garza looked at her with his clear, uncomplicated eyes. "What about Morrow?" "I'll handle Morrow." She was already moving toward the cook tent. "Start with the men who are standing around doing nothing. They're the easiest." Tommy was inside, sitting on the flour barrel with his knees drawn up, and he looked at her when she came in with an expression that was frightened but not panicked. The expression of a child who has learned that fear and usefulness are not mutually exclusive. "I left you a note," Nora said. "I know. I read it." He paused. "I didn't know what to do with it." "It doesn't matter now." She scanned the tent. The stove was burning. She crossed to it and closed the damper, not because fire was the primary danger, but because it was the thing you did. She took the 2 lanterns from their hooks and set them on the ground away from the canvas walls. Habit. Discipline. The small, manageable things when the large, unmanageable thing was happening outside. "Can you run?" she said. "Yes." "When I tell you to, you run north. Pete Garza will show you. You stay with Pete, do you understand? Not your father, not anyone else. Pete." "Why not my father?" She looked at him. He was 23 years younger than the question deserved, but he had asked it straight, and she answered it straight. "Because I don't know where your father is yet. And Pete I can account for." Tommy nodded. He got down from the barrel. Morrow was standing at the edge of what had been the cut bank, and there was no longer a cut bank to stand at the edge of. The section she had seen from the overlook had widened. It was 50 feet now, perhaps 60, and the river was not pouring through the gap so much as it had simply annexed that portion of the bank and declared it river. And the water was spreading across the low ground between the bank and the equipment shed in a thin, quickening sheet that caught the morning light and looked almost pleasant, almost inconsequential, until you noticed how fast it was moving. Morrow heard her coming and turned. His face was doing something complicated. "Nora." "The road north," she said. "The Ridgemont logging road. How long to get the crew there?" He stared at her.
Behind him, the water continued its quiet annexation. "The river's not going to—" "Caleb!" She had not used his given name before. It stopped him. "The substrate under this entire camp bend has been saturated for 4 days. I have been telling you this for 4 days. The cut bank is gone. The water is already at the equipment shed foundation. In 30 minutes, this ground will be under 2 feet of moving water, and in an hour it will be 4. She held his gaze. "I sent telegraphs to the county land office and the freight office yesterday. There will be people coming.
But they are not here yet, and the road north is passable now, and may not be passable in 20 minutes. So I am asking you, as clearly as I know how to ask, how long to get the crew to that road?" Something moved through his face. It was not pleasant to watch, the particular movement of a man revising his understanding of a situation he had been certain about, doing it in public, doing it fast. She had seen it before. She waited. 10 minutes, he said, "if they move." "Then go make them move." He went. What happened in the next 10 minutes was not orderly. Orderly was not available. What was available was Pete Garza, who had already gotten 6 men moving north and was working on the remaining 4 with a cheerful, implacable persistence that seemed to confuse them into compliance. What was available was Wren Oakes, who had come back from somewhere near the river with mud to his knees and had found his son standing outside the cook tent and had put one hand briefly on the boy's shoulder before looking up and finding Nora's eyes across the clearing. She held his gaze for a moment. He nodded once. Not an apology, not quite, but something adjacent to it. An acknowledgement. She accepted it and moved on. Decker was the problem. Decker had gotten it into his head that the equipment could be saved, the rigging, the donkey engine, the saw chains, and he was in the equipment shed doorway arguing with the water, which was now 3 inches deep on the shed floor and rising, and also arguing with Morrow, who was telling him to leave it, and also arguing with the general principle of the situation, which he clearly felt had not been fairly arranged. 8 days, he was saying. Finch needs that section in 8 days, and if we lose the equipment— Decker, Nora's voice. He turned. The equipment is already lost. The question now is whether you are. He looked at her. He looked at the water on the shed floor. He looked back at her. "I've been in river camps 12 years, he said. It was not an argument. It was the last thing he had. "I know," she said. "Come out of the shed." He came out of the shed. They were 60 yards up the Ridgemont Road, the full crew of 14 men plus Nora and Pete Garza, when the main breach came. She heard it before she saw it. A sound like the earth clearing its throat, like something subterranean and massive simply deciding to stop pretending, and she turned and watched the near bank of the Whitmore River give way along a 120-foot section and the river come through. It did not rush. That was the thing that stayed with her afterward, that she would try to explain to people who had not seen it and who expected drama to move quickly. It came through the way a very large and very patient thing moves when it has finally been given permission. It spread across the campground in a gray-brown sheet, and the cook tent went first, the canvas lifting briefly like something trying to leave before the water took it flat. Then the bunkhouse, the water rising against its walls, and the walls holding for a moment, and then not holding. The equipment shed was already gone. Tommy Oakes was standing beside her on the road. He was watching the place where the cook tent had been. "The flour barrel,"
he said. Yes, she said. And the stove. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. You closed the damper, he said, before we left.
I saw you. Old habit. He looked at her with the precise, attentive expression she had noticed in their first morning together. The expression that meant he was filing something away. Why? He said. Because you do the small things you can do, she said, even when the large thing is already happening, especially then. Behind her she could hear the men, the sounds of men who have just watched something they were certain was permanent become temporarily a river, processing this fact in the various ways that men process such things: silence, profanity, a strange and inappropriate laughter from somewhere near the back of the group that stopped itself quickly. Morrow came to stand beside her. He was looking at the camp. The Roseburg office, he said. You sent to Roseburg. And the freight office. When will they? I don't know. Yesterday afternoon, depending on who read it and when. She watched the water. There will be a rider, probably, or Oughton, if he made it to high ground with the team. He'll go back to Harlan. Morrow was quiet for a long time. The river moved through the camp with its patient, indifferent thoroughness. I should have listened, he said. It cost him something. She could hear the cost of it. She did not say, yes, you should have. She did not say, I told you. She had known, from the first morning she had watched him eat his breakfast alone, that he was not a bad man, only a certain kind of man, the kind who has been right enough times to have stopped checking whether he was right. There were many such men. The world was organized around them. Everyone's accounted for, she said. That's what matters now. He nodded. He did not look relieved. Relief would come later, if it came at all. For now he looked like a man standing in the rubble of a certainty, taking inventory. Pete Garza appeared at her elbow with a tin cup of coffee, which was so improbable that she nearly laughed. I grabbed the pot, he said, with the mild explanatory tone of a man who had simply seen a thing that needed doing and done it. Before I rang the bell. Seemed like it might be a long morning. She took the cup. It was hot. She held it in both hands. Pete, she said. Yes? You're a good person. He considered this with his usual cheerful equanimity. My mother always said so, he agreed. Though she had her own reasons. She almost laughed again. Down the slope, the river continued its work. Then she heard it. A horse on the Ridgemont Road, coming from the north, moving fast. Too fast for the road conditions. Too fast for a casual rider. The sound reached them before the horse did, and Nora turned toward it with a feeling she could not immediately name. The rider came around the bend at a canter and pulled up hard when he saw the group of men on the road. And he was young and mud-spattered and breathing hard, and he had a leather dispatch bag across his shoulder, and he was looking for someone, scanning the faces. And when his eyes found Nora, he said, Are you the woman who sent the telegraph? I am, she said. There's a second camp, he said, upriver. Finch's East Section crew, 12 men. He was still catching his breath. The land office got your message and they sent riders, but the East Section road is already under and nobody... He stopped, looked at her. Nobody up there knows. The tin cup was still in her hands. She set it down on a root at the road's edge with the careful, unhurried motion of a woman who has already decided what she is going to do next. She looked at Morrow. He was looking at her. "How far is the east section?" she said. The rider's name was Aldous Crane. He had the look of a man who had pushed a horse hard and was not sorry for it. Hat dark with rain, boots soaked through, the kind of stillness about him that comes not from calm, but from having burned through panic somewhere on the road and arrived at the far side of it. 3 miles, he said, answering Nora's question about the east section. By the high road. But the high road crosses the Whitmore Fork at Bennett's Crossing, and if the main channel is running where it is now— The fork will be worse, Nora said. It was not a question. Crane looked at her steadily. Yes, ma'am. Morrow said nothing. He was standing at the road's edge, with water still running from the brim of his hat, and he was looking at Nora with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not deference, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has recently been proven wrong about something important and has not yet decided what to do with that information. There's a ridgeline path, Nora said. It runs above the fork, comes down behind the east section cookhouse. Crane blinked. I didn't know that. It's not on any road survey. It's a game trail, mostly, wide enough for a man on foot. She looked at Morrow. You've been running this camp for 2 seasons. Did you ever walk that ridge line? A beat. No, he said. I did, she said. 3 days ago, before light. I wanted to understand the drainage. She said it without accusation, simply as fact, the way she had said most things to him since the morning she arrived. She had long since stopped hoping the facts alone would be enough. But they were what she had, and she had kept cataloging them anyway, the way a woman keeps a ledger even when no one is asking to see it. She looked at Crane. Can you keep up? He almost smiled. I'll manage. They went up through the timber in single file, Nora leading, Crane behind her, and Morrow, who had not been asked and had not been told to stay behind, following at the rear without a word of explanation. The ridgeline path was exactly what she had described, narrow, unpredictable, overgrown in places by sword fern and fallen branch, but running consistently above the waterline. Below them, through the trees, the sound of the river was enormous. It had stopped sounding like water. It sounded like the earth itself making a decision. Nora moved quickly. She had learned the path in daylight and silence. She was relearning it now in the dark and noise, and her body did the work of translating. The same instinct that had told her 3 days ago to walk the ridgeline, not because anyone had asked her to, not because it was part of cooking breakfast, but because she had looked at the river and understood that a person who knew where to go when the water came would be worth more than a person who didn't. That same instinct was in her feet now, reading the ground. Crane stumbled twice. Morrow kept pace without stumbling, and she noted this without comment. They heard the east section camp before they saw it. Voices raised in the specific register of men who are alarmed but have not yet organized their alarm into action. Nora came down off the ridgeline at a low run, broke through the tree line, and found herself behind a cook tent nearly identical to her own. 12 men, some already moving toward higher ground, some standing in place looking at the water, which was coming through the camp's low edge in a slow, dark sheet. Not dramatic yet, not the wall of force that had taken the main camp, but moving steadily, and the ground beneath it soft enough that a man who stood in it long enough would feel the earth begin to give. A heavy-set man with a gray beard came toward her fast. "Who are you?" "Nora Vass. I cook for the main camp." She looked past him.
You need to move your men north and up right now, not in 5 minutes. I'm the foreman here. Teller's my name. I don't take direction from "You're about to," Crane said, coming up behind her, and showed the man something. A card or a badge. Nora didn't look. County Land Office. We had a telegraph from your main camp 3 hours ago warning of this exact situation.
The woman is right. Move your men.
Teller looked at Crane, looked at Nora, looked at the water coming quietly and steadily through the low edge of his camp. He turned and began shouting at his men. It took 11 minutes, Nora counted, not because she was measuring anyone's performance, but because counting was a way of staying present, of keeping the part of her mind that wanted to run ahead of itself tethered to the actual sequence of events. 2 men had to be pulled away from a supply tent they wanted to empty. 1 man had left his boots somewhere and could not find them, and spent 3 of the 11 minutes looking before another man simply threw him a spare pair. They moved north along the high logging road, 14 boots and 12 men, and the gray-bearded foreman Teller, who walked at the rear, and looked back once at his camp with the expression of a man watching something he had built disappear, which is what he was doing. Nora walked beside him for a moment. "You couldn't have known," she said. Not kindly, not unkindly, just accurately. "Someone knew," he said. "Yes," she said.
They found the main group from the Whitmore camp at the Ridgemont clearing, a wide, flat shelf of ground above the river line where the logging road widened into a staging area. Pete Garza had gotten them there. 14 men, all present, all standing around a fire that someone had managed to build despite the wet, wrapped in whatever they'd grabbed when the warning came. Tommy Oakes was sitting on a log at the fire's edge with his arms around his knees. When he saw Nora come up the road with the East Section crew behind her, he stood. She walked to him first. "You did well," she said. "I followed Pete like you said." He paused. "Dad's here too." "I know," she said. She had already located Wren Oakes in the group, standing near the fire with a cup of something in his hands, watching her with the particular expression of a man who has been carrying a private acknowledgement for several days and has not yet found the occasion to set it down. She would give him the occasion later. For now there were 12 new men to account for, and cold, and the night still going, and everything that needed doing next. Doc Harwell arrived from Harlan before dawn. He came with May Dunnett's eldest son driving the wagon, and a second wagon behind carrying blankets and what looked like half the contents of May's dry goods shelves. He was a compact, unhurried man of 60 or so, with the kind of face that has spent decades arranging itself into expressions that neither alarmed patients nor dismissed them. He worked through the group methodically, a sprained ankle, 2 men with the early signs of exposure, a cut on Decker's forearm that had gone unnoticed in the chaos and needed cleaning and closing. Nora had already identified the cut and wrapped it with a strip of clean cloth from the supplies she kept in her coat pocket. Harwell unwrapped it, looked at it, and looked at her. "Clean wrap," he said. "Pressure in the right place." "It was bleeding steadily," she said. "Not fast. I've seen enough to know the difference." "Where did you learn that?" "My mother," she said, "and a season on a river crew in my 20s, where the nearest doctor was farther than 12 miles. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked past her to where Morrow was standing, close enough to have heard, far enough to have maintained the appearance of not listening. "Morrow," Harwell said, not unkindly, "you've got a capable woman here." Morrow was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the trees, the river was still running, enormous and indifferent, doing what rivers do. "I know it," Morrow said. And then, after another beat, with the particular difficulty of a man saying a thing he should have said earlier, "I've known it for a while." It was not an apology. Nora did not need it to be. What it was accurate, and accuracy was the currency she had always preferred. She turned back to the fire. By mid-morning, the water had crested and begun to recede. It left behind the kind of wreckage that floods leave. The cook tent collapsed on one side, the supply stores largely ruined. Two felled sections of timber shifted off their skids and deposited sideways across the low road like discarded matches. The camp itself was salvageable. It would take work and time and a renegotiation of Finch's 8-day deadline that Nora suspected was already underway in a telegraph office somewhere. She walked the perimeter of the damage alone in the early afternoon, taking stock with the same quiet thoroughness with which she had taken stock of everything since she arrived. The cut bank had collapsed exactly where she had predicted. The low ground where the men had been eating breakfast 4 days ago was under water. The cook tent's back wall, which she had reinforced with an extra line of rope on her second day at camp, had held. Small things, they added up. She was standing at the river's edge, lower now, still fast, the color of strong tea, when she heard boots on the mud behind her. Morrow stopped a few feet away. He looked at the river for a moment before he spoke. "The East Section crew," he said. 12 men. "Yes?" "If you hadn't gone up that ridge—" "Someone else might have thought of it," she said. "No," he said. "They wouldn't have." She didn't argue with him. She was tired, and the river was beautiful in its recession, the way destructive things sometimes are when they are finished. And she had no interest in performing modesty she didn't feel. "I'm going to write to Finch," Morrow said, "about the camp, about the flood." A pause. "About you?" She looked at him then. "The position," he said, "if you want it. Permanently. Better wage than what Otten offered you." He said Otten's name with the mild exasperation of a man who has recently learned he was given inadequate information about a new hire. "And a proper cook tent, with a floor." She looked back at the river. The far bank was still submerged, a line of alders standing in water up to their second branches, their leaves trembling in the current. "A floor," she said. "And a stove that doesn't list to one side." She almost smiled. "The stove lists because whoever set it didn't level the ground first. I shimmed it with a piece of cedar on the 3rd morning." He was quiet for a moment. "Of course you did." The river moved past them, carrying what it carried, bark and branch and the small debris of disrupted things, working its way toward whatever came next. Nora had spent enough of her life near water to know that rivers did not hold grievances. They moved. They did what the terrain and the season and the weight of what came before required them to do. There was a kind of instruction in that, if a person was paying attention. She had always been paying attention. "I'll think about the position," she said. It was not a yes. Morrow, to his credit, seemed to understand that it was not a no. He nodded and left her to the river. Tommy Oakes found her an hour later, back at the fire, working through what remained of the salvageable stores and making a list of what would need to come on the next supply wagon. He sat down across from her without asking, in the way he had taken to doing over the past several days, not intruding, just occupying the same space.
which was a thing she had come to find she didn't mind. "Are you staying?" he asked. "I'm thinking on it." He nodded, accepting this. He had the rare quality, in a boy his age, of not requiring more from an answer than the answer contained. She handed him a pencil and the back of the supply list. "Write down what you remember from the East Section camp. Anything you noticed when we came through. What they had, what they were short on." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because you notice things," she said. "And because someone is going to have to resupply them, and the more information we send with the wagon order, the better." He took the pencil. He began to write. Nora looked at her own list, and then at the fire, and then, one more time, the way she had been doing since the morning she arrived, the way she suspected she would keep doing for as long as she was near it, at the river. It was lower now, almost reasonable. The alders on the far bank were still standing, patient and waterlogged, waiting for the ground to firm up again beneath them. She turned back to her list. There was still supper to make.